Zhamak is the creator of the data mesh and innovative leader in distributed system architecture and digital platform strategy. At ThoughtWorks, she is the director of Next Tech Incubation North America and a member of the Tech Advisory Board. She also contributes to the creation of ThoughtWorks Technology Radar. Dan and Zhamak will be diving into the world of data mesh. You've likely heard of it, but it's less likely your organization is effectively implementing it. Zhamak, welcome to the Cinchy Learning Series. Before I pass it on to Dan, please feel free to ask your questions throughout the session. I will be monitoring the chat. Over to you, Dan, to introduce yourself and Cinchy.
Thanks, Fatima. Hey, everyone. I am Dan. I am the CEO and co-founder at Cinchy. For those who don't already know me, my background actually is in IT architecture and development. I used to work at a bunch of big global banks and created the Cinchy platform and company that's now been in market for just over 2 years. So thanks for joining us today. I'd say let's jump right in. So Zhamak, I'm very curious to hear the kind of the backstory behind why a data mesh, why now, what is the problem that it's solving, and what was that moment that that created that aha moment for yourself?
Thanks, Dan. It's great to be here and chatting with you. So yeah, a little bit of, I guess, gather around and we tell a little bit of the story, how it all began. My background is, like yourself, is kind of architecture, distributed architectures and distributed, I guess, computation networking. That's where I came from, and that's how I could see the world as we move from monolithic to kind of cloud native architectures. About 2018, I was the director of portfolio of clients in North America, and these were very technologically forward clients in the West Coast. I'm based in San Francisco, West Coast of the US, in Silicon Valley, many of them. And they had invested in their big data analytics platform for years. They had first generation kind of on-prem data analytics, and then second generation, and then they had gone on to cloud, but they were all asking for yet another solution. Their data strategy, they were still reformulating what their data strategy needed to be because they weren't getting results from the money they were spending. And one thing that one characteristic they all had in common was the scale. They had, ambitious plans in terms of how they want to use data. So a lot of kind of use cases, and they had a lot of kind of domains that could contribute to the pile of data. And I started kind of looking under the hood to say, what's going on? Like, what is not working and why we're spending so much money? And we're stuck in bootstrapping ourselves in actually getting access to data at scale.
Yeah, it's interesting because I had a very similar experience. I remember in the early days of kind of the establishment of data lakes, and there was so much hype and so much excitement and buzz about that. And quite frankly, like any hype cycle, there's always lots of confusion. And you had senior executives at big complex organizations signing off on $100 million investments with the belief that it's the panacea that's going to solve all the world's data problems, and then start to see kind of the incremental disappointment with where's the ROI, what's going on. This isn't what I signed up for. This isn't what I expected, and hence moving on to something new. So how would you describe what the data mesh is actually solving to someone who may be new to the concept?
Yeah, absolutely. So data mesh focuses on kind of the analytical use cases, analytical data plane, analytical meaning, your reports or training your machine learning programs where you need to have access to a historical view of the data, not necessarily the current, most up-to-date transaction, but how historically chain data has evolved and how it's evolving. And it tries to address the problem of scale. So it's not necessarily a solution to, a small company for a small company. So large companies, large number of domains, or large ecosystems, multiple companies try to share data. And what it does really challenges at core this idea of centralization of the data. Data has to be useful has to be centralized to be useful, and then the architecture around it all fairly monolithic, right, with a lake or warehouse or lake house. So it really challenges that, and it really backs on what we've been doing really in the operational world, which is breaking down the business based on the domain functionality, and then breaking down our tech based on domain functionality, right? We in the new world, in the last, let's say 15 years, 12, 13 years, we moved into kind of gradually towards service-oriented microservices because we value autonomy. We value having separate teams responsible for part of the business that mostly change localized to that part of the business. Your order management changes maybe not necessarily, interact with so much changes in, customer management, for example. So we've broken down into domains. So it piggybacks on that idea and basically extended to the analytical data. So it says, well, instead of breaking down our architecture around either technical kind of boundaries, like where the ingestion is versus where the serving is, let's break it down. Let's break down the architecture data and data ownership around the domain. So if you had a microservice that was serving your, if you're in healthcare, let's say claims department, or you have multiple services, let's extend the responsibility of that team and add a set of system adjacent to that now serving all of the claims history or the claim analytical view of the data. So at core is decomposition of the architecture data ownership back to where, back to the people who are most familiar and intimately familiar with that data around domains. And once you do that, then you're faced with a ton of other problems. How do I manage this, avoid the siloing of the data? So data as a product, it introduces a new architectural construct that makes the data shareable, usable, accessible, calls it data products, data served as a product. Then you have, operational costs to consider, like how do I actually make this autonomous team serve the data analytics without increasing the operational cost of running those stacks, exponentially. So it introduces a multi-plane data platform to hide the complexity of the data platform or the infrastructure, let's say provisioning, and goes beyond just the utility infrastructure provisioning, and it defines new sets of planes, I suppose, new sets of capabilities for abstracting complexity. And finally, to make sure we're not getting, we don't end up with a data mess and have a data mesh. Actually, these things talk to each other, and we have some level of interoperability. Introduces a governance model that heavily relies on federation of these domains having an active role in the governance, as well as heavily relying on those automated foundation and automated infrastructure to computationally embed a lot of the policy enforcement into every data product to make sure each of those data products, even though built owned separately, still interoperate with others. They comply with certain standards. They still secure this in compliance. So those four pillars that really come together to serve a more kind of, I would say, cloud native, more distributed architecture around analytical data.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It resonates for me, especially. I remember one of the big banks that I used to work at. I went through a little bit of a culture shock there because the way that they organized their people was with the idea of one throat to choke, which I like to reframe as one back to pat when everything goes well, which is having end-to-end accountability. And how can you be accountable for something if you have no control? And every time I've seen an organizational model where people are organized based on like a technological consideration, like, I don't know, something as simple as centralized testing, it never works. It can work in small pockets, but it relies on heroes. Where I see success over and over again is when you have that autonomy, that control your own destiny, and you own the end to end, rather than the horizontal concern. It's vertical focus, not horizontal. And really, this is doing that, but for not just the technology, but the people. So it facilitates that accountability and really aligns the people with the technology as well, so that you have that end-to-end view, which I think is awesome. I guess the original focus was on kind of the analytical universe, but what's your sense on where this ultimately ends? Does this draw a line right at the border between today what we think of as the analytical world versus the transactional world, or do they start to blend? Blur?
Absolutely, start to blend. I mean, to start with, they are blending because we're saying it's the same team. It's an extension of existing systems to now serve analytical data. Unfortunately, where we are today, the reality is that the technology that's supporting your transactional state, right, and storing the state of your stateful workloads is very different from the technology that gives access and also holds the computation, the data-heavy computation of transformation of the windows of data and large data sets, there are very, very different technologies. So today, it kind of respects the separation of the technology, but says let's integrate them more closely together as more closer units. But I think moving forward, we may end up somewhere that those are even getting closer and closer converging. I think at this point in time, I want to respect that we have different use cases, different access models for those operational and analytical world, but yet let's get them together as close as possible, bring them to the same team, bring them to the same group of people that are responsible for a particular domain. And then hopefully over time, the technology will converge as well.
Right.
That's what we are today.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I wouldn't mind actually digging into that a little bit and kind of exploring what it looks like when you start to go beyond kind of the analytical view. Like today, when you think of the transactional world, and obviously this has gone through a number of different waves of innovation, from monolithic to client server to service-oriented architecture to microservices and a bunch of little incrementals in between those things. And but today, largely you have users, and users use apps, and apps generally store data, and they will interact with a service layer that abstracts away the persistence and all the benefits and considerations of a microservices architecture. So that's largely how it works today in most organizations. And then we've talked a little bit about the analytical plane, but if you mash those two things together, if I take the current conventional thinking of an operational plane with the rethink on the analytical plane, is they don't fit. It's like a puzzle that can't be solved. So one of the things I wanted to dig in a little bit is how does ownership and storage work when you start to look kind of end to end across the spectrum? Like clearly, it's not as simple as you just add a bunch of lines, and that does not make any sense. So I know you spent days and days and days to produce. I'm joking.
I did have 30 seconds between two things.
Exactly.
And that's the best I do in 30 seconds. So.
I have to say, this is really good work for 30 seconds. I know we didn't leave you a lot of time, but I actually like it. I think it looks pretty good, and it's thematically consistent with your other illustrations. Just to go back, I see that one, and then I see this one, and yeah, it looks consistent. So
there is a story behind that, but we leave that for another day. I basically rushed into this conference and drew these diagrams on the plane getting there. Yes. And it kind of, and I thought, I'll fix them up one day, and I never did. So now I'm just okay with showing my schools. So I guess the question was like, where does the data reside? How does its data products interact with the microservice and apps? And DataMesh doesn't try to really have a prescribed solution, but there is a set of principles that maybe are demonstrated in this diagram. So first of all, that end-to-end responsibility. So usually our domains, I use an example of a healthcare domain here. You have the purple domain up there, which is like, let's say your clinical visits. You have a bunch of applications in the clinics running on the desktop of the doctor that's taking care of your visits. There are services behind the scene, or maybe legacy system, proprietary, it could be any form, that are actually capturing the state of those visits. And what we're saying is that now we want to show all the clinical visits, the history of the clinical visits, whether they're happening live as real-time, let's say, events, or more daily snapshots, however we decide to show the clinical visits over time, and we define that as this data product, which now it has a projection of all of those, or the transformation of all of those visits as a time window, infinite basically time window, and it provides access. On the right-hand side of this diagram, you see analytical solutions or machine learning. Let's say we have a bunch of reports, and we have a domain that wants to show train a machine learning model that shows the segmentation of your patients that you have based on their clinical conditions. Equally, there's another domain down there. Let's say it's a clinical claims. It's a payer domain. So that the claims that you make after you visit a doctor or go to the pharmacy, and there's a bunch of apps that are running to take care of the claims and the services behind them. So we may choose that, for whatever good reason, that those front-end applications actually have valuable data. For example, they're demonstrating how the person who's processing the claim is interacting with the application, so the user behavior or the doctor's behavior. And we want to capture the doctor's behavior, which is the best knowledge, best known to that application, in fact, not the microservice, as a data product, which is, claims application usage, for example. And similarly, on the microservices side, on the backend side, we might say that, in fact, with these domain, I think it's useful. We have, 5 generations of this claim processing. Instead of have 5 generations of data products for claims, let's have one data product that consolidates, the nuances between these different variations of the applications we have in N1, and present them as one consolidated claims data product that, again, shows the history of the claims for all of the patients that we have. And on the right-hand side, when it comes to kind of the usage of these data products, the machine learning might say, oh, in fact, to design my features that I want to train my machine learning model on, I need to know the behavior of the claims. I need to know the claim history of these clients. I need to know the doctor visits, and I need to know this across all of the products. So it creates a data product for itself, and it can share that data product. The reason it's a data product because it's a shareable asset. I use those words, God forbid asset, but product. And now it puts it in a data product that provides, let's say, file-based columnar information, and it trains the machine learning. And we have a domain around it because that analytical model doesn't sit in the ether by itself. It's part of a domain. And they say this domain is about care management. We want to know what the needs of our customers are or the patients are so we can satisfy those needs. That's kind of a very, the fluid in terms of where you want to store it, where you want to, which one of these needs to have a data product that really should reflect the need of the domains as well as the maturity of the technology within those domains. How many data products can you have?
Right. So is my so if I kind of play that back in maybe slightly different terms to make sure that that I'm following the data is a product I get. So data product, the services and the apps. Is it fair to kind of reimagine them as the apps are experience as a product, and the services are business capability as a product? So you've got experiences, you've got business capabilities, and then you've got data as your kind of 3 things that are each separately productized and, of course, organized within a domain so that there's still the end-to-end accountability. Is that fair? Okay. And then the other thing that you mentioned, which is interesting, is that every product, I won't say the word asset, but every product has to live in a domain. Is that a kind of one of the guide rails?
I think so. I think we need to move away from that, cross-functional ownership, as in a single function owns the data, and take the ownership back to the people who are most suited to do that job, which are, in my opinion, are the domains based on how we build our businesses, modern businesses today.
Right.
I mean, sorry to I'm not going to go down a rabbit hole, but I can imagine a future that we become, we change our perception and move to, data sovereignty, that individuals own their data. I can see an evolution that can happen, but we're not there yet.
One day.
One day.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, cool. And then, so one other question is is there any other rules that you find people commonly ask when they start to think through, like, for example, applications calling other applications within or across domains, services calling other services within or across domains, data products calling other data products within and across domains, and can a data product ever interact and talk to an app, or is it always kind of the left to the right flow? Like if there was any constraints where it's like, you would never draw a line from A to B, where would the boundaries be?
I think the point of having these as boxes with clear boundaries and clear interfaces, that you have defined that, this is my interface, this is my contract. Come and use it if it fits your purpose. There are no strong, hard rules as they share channel. Right. In fact, I think there should be a feedback loop, because those analytical systems are ultimately augmenting those apps to become smarter, right? So there is a feedback loop there that I didn't draw.
Right. So in other words, if you can potentially imagine a scenario where a data product needed to use an experience product, i.e. an application, maybe to get, click-through statistics or something that the experience is actually collecting. So they're each discrete and composable. Obviously, though, the tendency would be that the apps would use the services would use the data product, but it's not a hard rule. It is a bit of a free-for-all as long as you're honoring the contract of each product.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the data product kind of nomenclature that we've created, there's the idea of the input ports and output ports. So input ports are APIs or interfaces for getting data in, which could be from an app, could be from a service, and then the output ports is come and get the data out, but there are restrictions there. Like this is only read-only data, this is historical data, this is time-variant access. So there's to just identify this is not transactional storage, this is an analytical view of that transactions over time.
Right.
As long as that's respected, I think that's we have the mechanisms built in to allow the mesh way they come together.
Right. Yeah. Oh, very interesting. And then so
this can embarrass me to show how much more beautiful they can look like.
Well, I didn't get 30 seconds. I got a good 5 minutes here, so, and with your help as well. So yeah, this is basically drawing the same, just through a slightly different representation of it, because there's another question here that emerges around the data storage. But really, this is depicting the same flow where you have domains, and domains can have applications, or aka experience products, services, aka business capability products, and data products that can interact with each other. And the one actually error in this is that here we've violated one of the rules, which is it doesn't live inside of a domain. So big mistake there. Lesson learned. But one of the questions that I always have is like, where does the data physically reside? And I know that this is still a very logical picture. So here I have some services storing data, some not, some experiences storing data, some not. I can't imagine a data product that doesn't store any data. So I like my personal prediction of ignore technology constraints for a second. If you just imagine if you could just do anything, then where the data would likely belong is in the product, but letting services and apps have their own representation of that, meaning not necessarily forcing everyone to converge on a single ontology for the entire enterprise. But a different representation doesn't necessarily mean separation of storage and duplication of data. But what are your thoughts on kind of where you see this going?
Yeah, I think I might be a little bit more generous around copying data. I think where we will head towards, definitely we're going to change, like what's in that data product, what computation, where the computation resides and where the data resides. It's going to shift. That fabric is going to shift quite a bit. Right now, we move data around, copy it around to get to the computation so it can be processed. And I think in this case, it will change, like computation will come closer to the data itself. Where the data can live, I think it would be ideal to have the idea of the data products is that you have a good enough and high quality enough and easy to use representation of the data that the need for copying it around will reduce, right? So that's one way to reduce the copying it around. However, transformation of it and reshaping it and projecting it and make different views of it, that would continue to happen. So we can't really reduce the copying, but as long as the underlying semantic layer and underlying schema still retain the links to the original data, which is, I think it's something that data mesh assumes right now, then you still have the traceability that even though in this new data product I've merged and reshaped this data, I can trace it back to where the original entity came from.
Yeah, I would argue though that the act of reshaping the data, so take a simple example of just doing some aggregation, is actually the creation of new data. Of course, it's summary data. You need the lineage and traceability, but it is actually new data. So I wouldn't see that necessarily as copying of data. In a perfect world, that could be just a kind of on the fly calc on demand. But in a world with technological constraints, you may need to materialize that. But it's not a direct copy. In a different structure, it's actually different information.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah. Okay. Where do you think this is all going to go? Like, if you were to imagine a technology organization in, I don't know, 5 to 10 years, you can pick a timeline in terms of like how is it going to be different than how it is today? And then finally, where can people go to get more information?
Answer maybe second question first. In terms of where people go, I think at the moment there is a community. It's totally grassroots. I only consult the community. I'm not running the community. There are key people that have immense amount of energy running it, and I'm so grateful for that. So there is a community around data mesh learning. There's a Slack channel. Please join to talk. But I think where we're heading, I feel like a bit of a deja vu from 2012, 2011 when microservices started. I was deep in that because ThoughtWorks was a leader, again, implementing for our clients and evangelizing the concept. And it was bloody painful. And it's going to be painful with data mesh and data products as well, because technology is really 10 years behind. But I'm part of various working groups. I'm part of a cloud native working group. People are started thinking, questioning, okay, what does a cloud native with distributed data architecture look like, and what does the technology should look like? So I talk to vendors who are interested to make that shift. So I think for the next 2 years, probably we see the innovator adopters and lead adopters. We've seen, publications from Intuit, for example, as a kind of innovator adopter. I would say they're going to lead the way. It's going to be painful. We're going to make mistakes, and we're going to come back and talk in a year and say how to do data mesh right, not just how to do data mesh. And technology will catch up, I'm pretty sure. But the only thing I would say is that we've got to be, as a community, we've got to be careful, because we have this wonderful opportunity to imagine and rethink rather than try to retrofit the technologies that they built for centralization into data mesh, which we would end up doing initially. And that's what's going to hurt us. So I hope for companies to start innovating. You're one of those innovator CEOs. So I'm looking up to you as well to see what change comes down your product line to support a distributed model.
Right. Well, sadly, I can tell you from my experience, pretty soon everyone will start calling themselves a data mesh in the same way that data fabric went from what's that to everyone's looking for it to now everything is labeled as such. And I still remember one of our investors in an early board meeting said that when that happens, it's actually a good sign. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Dan, for the conversation. It was wonderful.
All right. Fatima, back to you.
Thank you. So just before we get into our Q&A, which there are so many fabulous questions in the question tab, if you have a look, if you have asked a question, both Zhamak and Dan have been answering your questions along the way, but do tune in on April 22nd with Dan and Concentra's COO, Neil Oswald, to learn why you don't want to be customer-centric, but you want to be everything-centric. Dan and Neil will share how Concentra is using data centricity and why data centricity is the key component of successfully unlocking the edge. So be sure to visit cinchy.com/learn to register. I am going to pop into the chat window since there are such great questions in that chat window, and we're going to open it up for some Q&A, and I'll just read out some of these questions. Okay, so the first one I have here is, hello, Zhamak, thanks for the presentation. I'm a fan. My question, is it possible that there could be situations arising due to decentralization or decentralized domains, product leading to increase in sizing of teams?
Thank you for that question. I think definitely the roles within the team increase. We are introducing new roles. But introducing new roles doesn't necessarily mean that you are adding new people assigned to that roles. You may do that. You may have new peoples assigned to that roles, or you may find that existing people in that team are now taking new roles. As an example, we talk about data product owner, right? Someone who intimately understands the data that is being generated and used by that domain and has a long-term ownership of that. You might actually think that the product owner that's already building the application that is the source of that data is actually best apt to play that role. So it might be the extension of the responsibilities and accountabilities and not necessarily increase of the numbers, or conversely, you could add more people initially. I feel like over time, in fact, we end up having more cross-functional people within our team, and the definition of a generalist would extend to people to actually know how to work with data as well. But initially, perhaps, yes, it could increase the number of people in the team.
Fabulous. I do want to be mindful of time. We are at 12:31. I know our session was to end a minute ago, so I just want to see how you are doing for time, both yourself and Dan, to see if we have the opportunity to answer, a couple more questions, since there are such wonderful questions in the chat today.
Sounds good.
Yeah, I'm good to stay on for a bit more, for sure.
Okay, perfect. So the next question I have here is, how are we managing master data, shared data across multiple data products in this mesh architecture?
Yeah. Dan, please chime in. I would love to know your thoughts on that as well. So every data will have a home and will have an owner. And if that happens to be an aggregation of multiple domains together, because we have a really good reason that aggregation absolutely needed, then we will have a domain, and then we will have people that are owning that data. But I will be careful with jumping to conclusions too quickly that we need these master data sets, because the purpose of the mesh is to have an ability to compose data from where they reside with those data product interfaces, right? And capabilities that they have in terms of merging and combining. So you may find that actually some of those master data, the need for them would dissipate. But if they do exist, then they will have a home and they will have a domain that they belong to.
Yeah, I would definitely see some scenarios where, for example, if you have fragmentation of, say, customer data, different representations, the desire to have a clean central master view of that, such that other consumers of that don't need to go through that same challenge of weaving together that view, will still make sense. But makes sense to me that become a product and needs to be owned just like any other product.
Fabulous.
Yeah, and maybe there is a subtle point to emphasize there, that the data product, let's say the customer, absolutely. The customer is one of those polyscenes, right? The information about it is fragmented across many different domains. But the purpose of that, the federated governance, is to actually look at those polyscenes and say, okay, which of these polyscenes we need to standardize its representation, like at least its identification across all of those domains. So before that fragmented customer data, as part of it, let's say your orders or clinical visits or whatever that domain is, becomes part of a data product from that domain, has gone through that transformation of standardization. So again, bringing these together right at the point of consumption, which is wherever you want to use that data, reduces again the need for those master data, but it doesn't remove it, it just reduces it.
Perfect, thank you. Again, I'm going to be mindful of time, and we'll take another 1 or 2 questions if that's okay with the two of you.
For sure.
Perfect. Should the bounded context in organizations be defined according to the domain-driven design before we implement, data mesh with data products? So
I pause because I'm curious about Dan's thoughts before I say anything. So I do think that it would be difficult to get the value that you want to get really from data mesh without removing those functional boundaries that exist. So imagine this. Imagine that you don't have a domain-driven architecture and design of your organization, and you have a very functional organization, as in businesses sit on one side, IT sits in the middle, and the data is the back of the IT department, right? And then you say, oh, I want to build data mesh. So what do? You go into that big kind of data department and then start breaking your data apart and building these data products, which is not just the data itself, it's data, policy, metadata, computation, all that as one. That seems to me a hell of an over-engineering for not actually getting the benefit, because the benefit is to get the scale, have these autonomous teams to kind of be able to scale and be as close as a change. Because by the time you get to that data product, right, at the end of the production of the data, and cleans it and build this data product, guess what? Business moved on. The representation of the data has already changed. So I feel like at least it has to be incremental and iterative move to domain-driven. Maybe you don't need to be fully domain-driven everywhere, but at least you have to be on that journey of transformation. Not that you have done it and now its job is done and now let's add data mesh on top of it, but you have to be somewhere in that journey.
Yeah, what I would say is for organizations that have been adopting domain-driven design for their software architecture, the extension of that into the world of data, not limited to analytics, would be more natural to an organization that isn't there. But regardless, you got to start somewhere because it's not about a sudden overnight transformation of the entire organization. So even if you were ultimately to start in the world of data, even if you look at it from an analytical perspective, but just know that that's not where it stops, because the real advantage is when you get to that scale and you're starting to align ownership to accountability and control, regardless if it's an operational consideration or an analytical consideration. But you got to start your journey somewhere.
Yeah. Dan, you always say what I want to say so much more eloquently. So I really appreciate that you chime in.
Well, what I do is I let you answer first. This is the harder part of that. I just play it back. That's it. All right.
Perfect. Are you guys up for one more question? This is actually more of a scenario-based than a straight-up question. So say app 1 is in domain 1 and creates data product 1. A data analyst creates some great analytics from data product 1 that app 1 wants to consume on a regular basis. Is the data product 2 is that data product 2 and what domain would that data product 2 be in? Especially important for ML ops.
Yeah, so do you want me to try it first? And
sure, go ahead. Let's turn it around. Yes, let's see if I can do what you do so perfectly.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So my thoughts on that is that it absolutely would be a different product if the ownership of that resulting data falls under a different boundary. So the question, I think, is when data is produced, be it the result of a summarization or the result of an AI model or whatnot, it still falls down to aligning it to the business ownership and knowing that not all attributes of a single entity necessarily mean that there's a single owner of all such attributes. They can align on the definition of the entity, but the attributes can be federated and owned by different departments that look at things from a different perspective. So I think it's more of it depends on who ultimately owns the analytic in that particular scenario.
I do agree. So let's contextualize it a little bit more because I think there are a couple of nuanced attributes there. So let's imagine this domain 1 was your artist domain. Let's say we are in a Spotify world, and it has all the information about the artists and the artists that come on the platform to share the content. And this new analytical product or system is the detection of emerging artists, right? So then you can think about this emerging. Why do we want to do this? Because we want to, extend our business operation for our artists and the value we deliver to them to give them some new opportunities if they are emerging artists. So then you can think about this either in terms of so certainly that emerging artist is a separate thing from artists, right? But either it can be implemented as I will provide data around our emerging artists on a daily basis, on our event basis, or however it is, and I'm just producing this data that you can come and consume, in which case that would be an emerging artist would be a separate data product. However, it might be the case that that the code, the ML classification that detects the emerging artist, while it gets trained on top of the data from the artist domain, but in fact that ultimate results of that is a microservice that is being deployed where you can query that service to say, artist X, is this an emerging artist or declining, or what's the classification? So in that case, then it really is not a data product anymore. It's becoming an operational service or an intelligent product, microservice. So again, what that is, analytical solution, it could be an intelligent product, like a microservice, it could be a data. But then the question is, where does it belong? Does it belong to the artist domain? Should that team that have the responsibility of emerging artists, or should be somewhere else? And it really comes down to your organizational design at that point, right? Is this just something we're experimenting within the artist domain? Yeah, let's just keep it there. Is this something that business going full ahead and building a bunch of other capabilities around it, and it deserves to have its own team, then it will have its own team. It really depends on the context of the organization at that time.
What that also means is by aligning things to the business, the reality is the business isn't isn't stagnant. It doesn't stop changing, so it's continuously changing. So as organizations start to do this at more scale, they need to account for that inevitable change of reorgs, and that's going to have a cascading consequence. So it's just something to kind of anticipate in future evolutions, is the ability to have that agility to kind of reallocate based on changes in ownership on the business side.
Yeah, and that's actually a really good point, because one of the principles around kind of this federated governance is that we need a governance model, how we define data, the boundaries around them, all of that really embraces this dynamic nature of reality we live in. And the technology has to agree as well with that nature. So that's why this data mesh, it should be so easy to kind of move these autonomous data products, come on board, go offline, move around. So that should be part of kind of design of the platform.
Yeah, composability, plug and play. Apps come and go, data lives forever.
Yeah.
All right, Fatima, is it possible that we take the other questions perhaps offline, and then we can get?
Yeah, we can definitely find a way to grab those questions and find a way to distribute the responses, for sure.
Okay, great.
So thanks again for everyone who participated today. It was a fantastic session with some amazing questions. And thanks again, Zhamak, for joining us today and sharing your knowledge and your insight with all of us. And for those of you that are still on the line, be sure to visit again, cinchy.com/learn to register for our next learning series session, which is on April 22nd with Dan and Centra CEO, Neil Oswald. Thanks again, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your Friday.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.
Bye.